Welcome and thank you all for coming. My name's Stefanos Bibas. I am a professor of law and criminology here at Penn. I direct the Supreme Court Clinic, and I am very honored to moderate this discussion, this panel debate on marriage as a public good. I also happen to be a member of the university's Committee on Open Expression. And I'm very proud that Penn, in the tradition of Benjamin Franklin, is one of the few top universities to earn a green light from the Foundation on Individual Rights and Education. We have a tradition at this university, in the spirit of Ben Franklin, of open and vigorous but respectful disagreement and discussion. Doesn't mean there aren't some sharp elbows, sharp disagreements, and pointed questions, but we do so respectfully, without quieting or silencing, but by countering argument with argument. And I'm very grateful that we have both respect without name-calling, but also that kind of vigorous challenging. The Federalist Society is a conservative and libertarian-leaning organization, but takes no position on issues, and I know that members of the Federalist Society have competing and contrasting personal positions on same-sex marriage, both as a political and as a constitutional matter. We don't want any of the positions to be represented by strawmen, but neither do we want to shrink from the defense of unpopular views. And it is something that, when I was talking earlier today with the Associate Dean of Students, Gary Clinton, we were both very, very proud that Penn, unlike some other universities, is a place that is genuinely open and welcoming of a range of viewpoints. We chose the Federalist Society chose the lineup that it did so that the panel can carefully consider three questions, interrelated but distinct questions. The first of them is, what business, if any, does the state have in regulating marriage in the first place? Why not leave it to churches or other civil organizations? Second, does the Constitution, as a judicial matter, require that if states regulate marriage at all, that they extend it to same-sex couples on the same terms as to opposite-sex couples? And finally, quite apart from whether there's a constitutional mandate that judges ought to be enforcing, is it good policy? Is it something that legislatures ought to enact or voters ought to enact by referendum? And I'm very pleased that not only do we have two, but three sides of a debate that really should be fleshed out from different perspectives, and a very, very distinguished panel. Sherif Girgis was born in Cairo and grew up in Delaware. He majored in philosophy at Princeton, where he won several academic prizes, including the 2007 Dante Prize for the nation's best undergraduate essay on Dante. He wrote a senior thesis on sex ethics that won Princeton prizes in ethics and philosophy. After graduating Summa and Phi Beta Kappa, he went on to earn a master's degree as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, and is now pursuing his PhD in philosophy at Princeton and his JD at Yale Law School. His paper, What is Marriage, with Robert George and Ryan Anderson, was the SSRN most downloaded paper of the year, and then became a book released in fall 2012 that also was extremely popular and influential. And he'll speak first. After him, we have Dr. John Corvino, professor and chair of the philosophy department at Wayne State University in Detroit. With Maggie Gallagher, he's the co-author of Debating Same-Sex Marriage and authored What's Wrong with Homosexuality, both by Oxford University Press. He was a columnist, the gay moralist, on the web, and was also a contributor to The Advocate, the LA Times, the Independent Gay Forum, the Huffington Post, the New Republic, and the New York Times. And over the last 2 decades, he's spoken at more than 200 campuses on sexuality, ethics, and marriage. He's received numerous awards, including Distinguished Professor of the Year and a Spirit of Detroit Award for his work on behalf of LGBT rights. His YouTube videos have received nearly 1 million hits, but no surfing them during the talk. Afterwards, please. Finally, we have Trevor Burrus, a research fellow at the Cato Institute Center for Constitutional Studies, who researches constitutional law, civil and criminal law, legal and political philosophy, and legal history, and does work, including work on the Supreme Court. His academic work has appeared in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, the Albany Government Law Review, and Syracuse Law Review, and has done popular writing in Forbes, USA Today, Huffington Post, the New York Daily News, and others. He's the editor of A Conspiracy Against Obamacare and holds a BA in philosophy from Colorado and a JD from Denver. I hope you'll join me in giving all of our panelists a warm welcome.
Well, Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thanks to Rob and to Lee for the invitation and for what seems to be a fantastic conference. And thanks to my co-panelists. It's great to be with Trevor for the first time. I really look forward to his perspective on this issue. It's one that sometimes goes under-recognized. And it's always great to be on a panel with John Corvino. We go back many years now. Anytime one of us gets invited to do something, we rope the other one in. I think because we know exactly what they're going to say. And so we have all our bases. But also because, as you're going to see, he's not just a very good thinker and speaker at clarifying these issues and helping us to understand them, but he's also a very decent guy and a very good friend. I want to say something about each of the three guiding questions today, but in a slightly different order. So first, a little bit about the policy issues and how to think about those. Second, connected to that closely, of course, why the state should be involved in this business in the first place. And then third, something about the equal protection argument, about the constitutional case for or against requiring states to recognize same-sex marriage. On the policy debate, I think the first and most important thing I want to get across is that it has been misconceived on both sides. Most people think of it as either a debate primarily about a kind of up or down vote on the morality of same-sex relationships, or primarily a matter of equality, of expanding or restricting the pool of people eligible to get married. And I think if you see it in either of those ways, you're going to miss really important dimensions to the debate, so on either side of the political spectrum. I think it's not primarily about the moral status of same-sex sexual relationships. I think you could think that those were ennobling and enriching and an important part of many people's personal lives and still have a different view about the political issue. And I don't think it's fundamentally or first about equality. Everybody in this debate is for marriage equality if they're for marriage recognition at all. At least I am. The question that's prior to that is, what is marriage? What kind of relationship is it, and why is the state recognizing it? And only when you have answers to those questions can you tell us when a policy is failing to recognize some marriages in violation of equality, and when what it's not recognizing is something else entirely. What is the vision of marriage? What's the answer to those questions that's on offer in the debate today? Well, I think on what I'm calling the revisionist view, the view that's proposing to revise what it sees as an unjust marriage regime, it's really hard to distinguish. In fact, I'm going to argue it's impossible to distinguish marriage from companionship more generally. And that's one of the first key problems. By the lights of anybody in this debate, some things distinguish marriage in particular from the wide range of forms of companionship, but this view can't give you a principled account of them. Why? Well, you can think first of all about what relationships are in or outside of the circle of marriage on this view. You've got two men, let's say, who are committed to sharing all the burdens and benefits of common life, who live together, who are in it for the long haul. Perhaps they're actually co-raising a child of one of them from a previous marriage. Maybe one of them is a widower. If they are brothers, if the brother came in to help his brother after the death of his spouse, they are not recognized as a marriage on this view. There's something fundamentally different. If what brought them together is a sexual relationship, then they are. So one of the distinguishing features, I think the primary distinguishing feature of marriage, it's not all that there is to marriage on this view, but it's what sets marriage apart from other forms of living together and making life together, is a certain kind of romantic companionship, a certain kind of emotional union or intensity or priority. The first thing to note about that is that there's nothing fundamentally gay or straight about it. It's something that just cross-cuts those distinctions. It's something that a lot of heterosexual couples may understand their own relationship to reflect. And my first claim is that that view gets marriage wrong on the merits. Why? Well, most people think that to get a marriage off the ground, you have to pledge to permanence, for example. That's one of the things that makes marriage different from other forms of companionship. But I think if this view of marriage is right, if what's distinguishing of marriage is that certain kind of emotional union or regard, you can't explain that norm. There's no more reason to pledge permanence than there is to pledge to be together for as long as love lasts, where love is understood, is that distinguishing feature. And once you don't have that anymore, the thing has reverted to a friendship. It would be inauthentic to remain within it. This is an understanding of marriage that I think has been growing outside of the context of same-sex relationships through things like no-fault divorce in ways that some proponents of same-sex marriage will recognize and identify. Johns Hopkins sociologist Andrew Cherlin talks about the expressive individualist understanding of marriage that says get out if it doesn't have that emotional fulfillment because it's inauthentic to stay. The idea of pledging to sexual exclusivity, it's another thing that most people on both sides think is critical to get a marriage off the ground. Again, I don't think you can explain it in any principled way. If sexual exclusivity fosters the emotional union and intensity and priority given the temperament or taste or situation or context of the couple, then it's good. And if it's not, then it's an oppressive inhibition on what really makes the relationship a marriage and what makes it flourish as a marriage. Even the idea that marriage is inherently a relationship of two, I think, and intrinsically two people. Two men, as well as a man and a woman, can be emotionally united and share all the burdens and benefits of common life and face the world together, but so can three men. And some people are increasingly coming out as being most personally fulfilled by a multiple partner relationship. There was a New York magazine profile of something called a throuple, which is a three-person couple. And there the three men involved said exactly the same things. We don't want to be stigmatized. We don't want kids that we raise to be stigmatized. We're making the sacrifices of common life together. There's no basis except arbitrary attachment to tradition to say that marriage is inherently two. I think even the idea that marriage is inherently sexual, probably the most basic intuition about marriage, is hard to make sense of. If what sex is contributing to the marriage is just the kind of emotional expression or fostering of attachment, then in principle it's replaceable. And there's no deep distinction between platonic and sexual relationships in that respect. Permanence, exclusivity, monogamy, sexual union, all of these things that seem to mark marriage on both sides of the debate, whatever you think of opposite or same sex, start to look just as arbitrary. Every bit as unjust to require as a general norm if the revisionist view of marriage is right. I've proposed before and have often challenged proponents of same-sex marriage to give us a principled account of what marriage is. We know one thing they believe it's not, which is inherently opposite sex. But tell us what marriage is, such that these other norms aren't arbitrary, aren't just attachments to tradition. And I don't think I've pressed it before with John in debates, and I haven't found an answer, and I don't think one is forthcoming, not because of lack of resources or talent on his part, but because of something intrinsic to the view. And it's not something I think that you can do without. Because if you can say, for example, it's two because there's something special about two, then it's open to the proponent of the conjugal view, the traditional view, to say the same thing about opposite sex, and it doesn't get us anywhere. The second thing to note about that is that it has consequences for the policy debate. Why? If you are enshrining a view of marriage through its eligibility requirements, through these other changes, that can't explain the stabilizing norms of marriage, then you can expect over time that people will absorb that view, will come to believe it more and more, and eventually will come to live by it more and more. And that will have real-life consequences. It will undermine the stabilizing norms that get the state involved in marriage in the first place. And an example of this is the no-fault divorce revolution, and it really was a kind of revolution. At the beginning, everybody said, it's a win-win. If you are in a high-conflict marriage, these changes just make it easier for you to get out. And if you're in a low-conflict marriage, what do you care? How would it affect you or your marriage? And on this, in this case, the results have come in over many decades, and we know that that was a mistake. Making the exit requirements much lower, in fact, getting rid of them entirely, in effect, didn't just make it easier for the high-conflict marriages to dissolve, it made people more likely to keep their eyes on the exit ramp and more likely to take it as a result of that. And that has real-life consequences because of the connection between marriage and the next generation. I think the libertarian account of basically seeing and I don't want to speak for Trevor's account in particular, but one concern that people will raise against what I've said so far is that maybe it shows that there's no principled lines to draw. We should just get out entirely. What difference would it make? And I think if it were true that everybody always were an autonomous, completely self-directing individual with no basic dependencies on others, that would be one thing. But we know that everybody starts out not that way at all. The next generation, children, everybody starts out as a child, and children in particular need something that spontaneous adult preferences don't always provide, which is stability. The state is in the marriage business because it has to uphold the stabilizing norms of marriage, because those in turn have an effect on the common good in every dimension. And I think the primary debate is not about whether that's needed at all, but about which vision of marriage will do a better job of upholding those stabilizing norms. Will it be the vision that collapses marriage into companionship more generally, or another one? And at this point, I just want to say something brief about the other vision. What is this alternative view that supposedly makes sense of all the stabilizing norms of marriage? Well, in the book that was mentioned, my co-authors and I described this as the conjugal view of marriage. It's not peculiar to us. It's also not peculiar to the Jewish or Christian scriptures. It has remarkable parallels and resonance with the work of folks like Plato and Aristotle and Xenophanes and Musonius Rufus and Plutarch, who never touched a Hebrew Bible or read a letter from St. Paul. But the way we describe it and kind of capture it in a unified idea is by the concept of comprehensive union. The basic idea is this. Any kind of union, any kind of community, any kind of bond or companionship is made by common action, by activity towards common ends in the context of a commitment. And in those three distinguishing ways, the communion, the commitment of marriage is comprehensive. What does that mean? We'll take the first one, unifying activity. It's comprehensive in the sense that the two are united not just in heart and mind, but in heart, mind, and body. Most people think that's true. Most people also think that sexual union has something to do with the bodily element of that union. But how? Well, we think if it's just the matter of sex contributing to and fostering attachment, you wouldn't be able to make sense of that idea. The best way to make sense of it is by analogy to union within a person. What makes me, my heart and lungs and other parts, one body is that they're all actively coordinated towards a single bodily end of the whole that they make up, which is my biological life. And that kind of radical bodily union is possible between two people, but just in the marital act of a man and a woman. In that act, the man and the woman themselves are actively coordinated towards a single bodily end of the whole that they make up together. So they are extending their union of heart and mind along the bodily dimension. I think this makes sense of consummation laws, and it makes sense of the distinctions that the law was drawing way before gay and straight was the fundamental divide that people were thinking in terms of. It's comprehensive in the range of goods that unite them. It's not just oriented to the good of knowledge like a university or athletic excellence like a sports team, but somehow to the whole wide range of goods, because it's basically oriented to whole new human beings, new subjects of all of these goods. And what makes that true? Well, the very act that seals or makes marital love is also the kind of act that makes new life. And so marriage itself, the relationship that's embodied by that act, is fulfilled and extended by family life. But again, that's something that's best made sense of on the conjugal view, where it's inherently a male-female union. And if it's comprehensive in those two senses, in the dimensions of the partners united, in the range of goods around which they're united, then it calls for comprehensive commitment. And through time, that means permanence. And at each time, it means exclusivity. So permanence and exclusivity and sexual union and a connection to family life, all of the things that the revisionist view couldn't make any unified sense of, are given an account on this view. The final thing I'll say in one sentence that might have several semicolons is that the conjugal view of marriage on the constitutional question, the basic question amounts to basically, is this animus? Was this cooked up to oppress a group, to stratify, to balkanize, to subordinate? But the conjugal view of marriage that sees this that sees it as inherently opposite sex arose in the work, again, of folks unconnected to any particular religious tradition, but especially important, centuries and even millennia before our modern concept of gay identity and orientation, without any conception of a class of human beings against whom they might have had animus. There must be some rational basis apart from animus for something like this view. It's historically impossible to have been otherwise. Thanks.
Good evening. Thank you both. Good evening. Thank you. I know, it was a good dinner. I actually had wine with dinner. You didn't. You were smart. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to meet Trevor Burrus for the first time. I've heard great things about him, and it's particularly a pleasure to be back on a panel with my friend Sherif Girgis. People are often surprised to hear me refer to Sherif as my friend. They say, how can you, as a gay rights advocate and as a gay man yourself, be friends with somebody who's actively fighting against marriage rights for you? And the answer to that question is really quite simple. I drink. No, in all seriousness, the answer to that is, while Sherif and I disagree on a number of important issues, we agree that serious public topics deserve a serious public dialogue, and I think we both lament the fact that that dialogue is becoming more and more difficult on so many issues that we hold dear. So it's really a nice opportunity to be in this sort of setting where we can have that kind of dialogue. I want to start by talking about what strikes me as a sort of simple case in favor of marriage for same-sex couples. A simple, what you might call prima facie case for allowing same-sex couples to marry. And of course, there'll be more to be said after that. But I think it's important to start with the simple case because for so many people, actually on both sides of this issue, it seems sort of simple, right? And on my side of the issue, it often seems simple in the following way. Relationships are good for people, and marriage is good for relationships. Now, let me say more about what I mean there because there's potential for confusion. When I say relationships are good for people, I don't just mean they're pleasurable or that they satisfy people's desires, because as we know, some of our desires are worth satisfying and some of them we'd be better off not satisfying. I mean that they can bear good fruit in people's lives. I mean that that kind of commitment, having someone to dedicate one's life to, having someone to be your number one person, having someone to come home to at night, to wake up with in the morning, to share one's joys and sorrows with, to be committed to, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, till death do you part, can be an important avenue of human flourishing. And this is good not just for the couple, but also for the people around them. Because when there's someone whose job it is to take care of you and vice versa in this way, it means that the state is less likely to have to do that. When you are a happy individual as part of a happy couple, that makes for a happier society. So my simple case begins with this idea that it seems like a win-win, good for the couple, good for society. But where does marriage come into all of this? Well, I said marriage is good for relationships, and I want to emphasize the different ways in which it's good for relationships. We're at a law school, and of course we're going to be talking about some of the legal aspects of this question, and maybe some would like to talk about the constitutional aspects of this question. I missed that part of the email that said I was supposed to do that, by the way, which is good because I'm not a lawyer and I don't have a lot to say about the constitutional aspects of the question. But I do have a lot to say about the public policy aspects. When I say that marriage is good for relationships, part of it is that this personal commitment is good. Part of it is that the public commitment is good. When you stand in front of your friends and family and say, this is the person I devote my life to, and your friends and family hold you to that, that helps relationships. And part of it is the legal aspect of it, where marriage legally creates next of kin. And I won't belabor the various ways in which it does this, because most of you are well aware of them, having to do with hospital visitation rights, making decisions in the event of a person's death. Some that we don't think about so often. If the person is a foreigner, you can helps you get residency status for that person. Might not seem like a big deal to you unless you happen to fall in love with someone who's not an American citizen. If the person gets into legal trouble, you don't have to testify against that person in a court of law. Might not seem like a big deal to you unless you happen to be dating a criminal. If the couple breaks up, as couples sometimes do, there are laws in place to help that go more smoothly, because marriage often involves people melding their lives and their property, not always in formal ways, but informally, and we have marriage law to help take all of that apart. All of that can be important because that commitment that I said is good for people is also challenging in various ways. One of the things that troubles me about the way the debate between Sherif and me sometimes gets framed is that when he talks about the conjugal view and contrast it with what he calls the revisionist view, he says that the revisionist view says that marriage is just an emotional commitment. And I don't know of anybody on my side of the debate who, when they think about it carefully, would really want to say that, insofar as when we think about marriage as commitment, part of the reason that commitment is important is because emotions are variable, that your feelings wax and wane over the course of a lifetime. Feelings can change, but that there's something about that enduring commitment that is valuable. Now, everything I've said in my simple case here, relationships are good for people, marriage is good for relationships, so why not do this for same-sex couples? Sherif and various other people in the room immediately come back and say, yes, but John, what you're talking about is not marriage. That first we have to get clear on what marriage is, and if we're clear on what marriage is, you'll see that it's impossible for same-sex couples to achieve this. Now, on the one hand, it seems obvious that same-sex couples can achieve this insofar as they can achieve this public commitment, this lifetime of mutual support, this public recognition that's happening in various states. But the argument goes that they cannot achieve this because marriage is, as Sherif puts it, a comprehensive union. And a comprehensive union is union on all levels, including bodily union. And bodily union must include coitus. But same-sex couples cannot engage in coitus, therefore they cannot have bodily union, therefore they cannot have comprehensive union, therefore they cannot have marriage. And so I want to say a little bit about why I find this argument unsatisfying, and even more why I find the whole focus on the what is marriage question somewhat unsatisfying, because I think what we end up having is the wrong answer to the wrong question. So let me say first about why I think it's the wrong answer. Partly I think it's the wrong answer because it treats marriage not as an evolving social institution, but as something that has this fixed essence that cannot change, that cannot evolve. And I think this is the wrong way to think about social institutions. But I don't want to emphasize that part of it. The main thing I want to emphasize is that the emphasis on coitus is misplaced. Now, there have been plenty of people before me who have made arguments along these lines, usually having to do with whether the union can be of a procreative type if we're talking about, say, sterile heterosexual couples. They say, well, imagine a couple that can't procreate, heterosexual couple. We still think that they're able to marry. Well, why aren't same-sex couples just another variety of sterile couple? And the response to this traditionally has been that the sterile heterosexual couple can still engage in acts of the procreative kind. To which my response is, no, their acts are precisely not of the procreative kind. That's why we call them sterile. And there's a lot of sort of frustrating back and forth on this, and I think both sides tend to get a little frustrated with the other side just sort of not seeing what seems obvious. Well, how could this be of the procreative kind if procreation is neither intended nor possible? But it's still of the right form. And one of the things I found very useful about the Girgis George Anderson book is the way it fleshed out and expanded the argument and talked about how this point needs to be understood in the context of a discussion of comprehensive union and coordination where the two bodies become literally, in some sense, one organism. In fact, elsewhere, Robbie George and Patrick Lee have said this, it makes them literally one organism when they engage in coitus. So I've actually, over the years, proposed a different counterexample to see if I could advance the argument a little bit further. And it's what I call the Bob and Jane case. Imagine a couple, we'll call them Bob and Jane, they're dating, planning to get married. And a few weeks before the wedding, Bob is in a terrible accident which paralyzes him from the waist down in such a way that it becomes clear that he can never engage in coitus. And he says to Jane, well, I guess we should call off the wedding. And Jane says, no, absolutely not. I love you. I'm committed to you. We will make this work. We can adopt children if we really want to have children. We must go through with this. This is what I want. And so Bob and Jane do get legally married, and they spend the rest of their natural lives together, decades together, mutually supporting each other, living as husband and wife, raising children that they adopt, and so on. And I ask the question, are Bob and Jane married? Not are they legally married, because obviously they are, just as same-sex couples can be legally married in 17 states and the District of Columbia and for 5 minutes in Michigan 2 weeks ago. I'm waiting. So are Bob and Jane really married? And it seems to me that the answer that Girgis, George, and Anderson have to give is no, because they can't engage in coitus, which means they can't have bodily union, which means they can't have comprehensive union. So I was very pleased that in their book, they responded to this objection in a very prominent place on an endnote on the next to last page of the book, in which Sherif and his co-authors say, well, look, there might be a softer version of our view where you could say they're part of a continuum with other couples where they would engage in coitus if they could, if it becomes feasible, but they can't, but they're still, and frankly, I mean, go look at that endnote. You'll say, I just don't think that the softer version works. Marriage is not about what people might do if things were different. It's about what they do. But then they say, look, on a strong reading of our view, it's true, Bob and Jane are not married. But that's just kind of unfortunate. And, lots of people can't get married for all kinds of reasons. But, we have these other intuitions about marriage that are stronger. So, this intuition that Bob and Jane are really married, we have to, bite the bullet and give up this intuition. I think this is a huge mistake. And I think that this mistake points to the problem where marriage has a number of historically important features, and its tendency toward procreation and family and child rearing, its sexual aspect, various things like that are all among those important elements. But if we start treating some of those as absolutely necessary conditions, such that without them we can't have a marriage, rather than seeing marriage as having multiple and varied purposes, we miss something very important. We, in fact, end up having to conclude not only that same-sex couples cannot marry, despite their commitment, despite their love, despite their sacrifice, and so on, but that people like Bob and Jane cannot marry. And I think that this conclusion is unacceptable. Let me conclude this part of my remarks. I want to save a lot of time for questions and discussion. But let me conclude this part of my remarks. I said I think this is the wrong answer to the wrong question. Let me say a little bit about why I think it's the wrong question. Let's suppose I were to say to Sherif and others, you know what? I've thought about it a lot. I've read your book. You're right. What I'm talking about is not marriage at all. You've got this notion of marriage, and what I'm talking about is something different. Let's call it something different. Let's call it schmarriage. It's more inclusive than marriage. It allows both same-sex couples and different-sex couples to engage in the institution. But it's not marriage. But you know what? It still seems good, right? I mean, because it still allows you to have marriage, if that's what you want, but allows the rest of us to make public commitments, to merge our lives in property, to stand in front of our family and friends, to have our family and friends and the state recognize this commitment. Why not? And if we start focusing on the question, what is marriage? The problem is that we treat this as a conceptual issue or an epistemological issue, not as a moral issue. Sherif says that if we expand our understanding of legal marriage to include not just the conjugal notion of marriage, but schmarriage, if we make it inclusive in this way, all these other problems are going to follow, and you see this in no-fault divorce and people's lack of commitment and so on. Well, I mean, those are empirical claims. They require evidence. My own view is that it's easy to point to a lot of the problems in marriage, and in fact, I would share concern about many of those problems in marriage. But it's not clear to me why we pin those on same-sex couples, and particularly on same-sex couples who are desiring to commit to have and to hold, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, till death do they part. So let me stop there, and I say that I look forward to further comments from the panel and to the discussion. Thank you.
This is exciting. I'm excited to be here with John and Sherif. They are hardened warriors in this debate in a way that I'm not. My first thought was marriage. Marriage is what brings us together today, which is interesting because in some way, you know, Sherif's got this argument that's like, you keep saying that word, but it doesn't mean what you think it means. So I think Federal Society, I think Sophia, I think everyone for bringing me out here. I especially thank John, Sherif for all their work on this issue. I don't think a lot about marriage. I haven't done this too much, and one of the reasons might be for some of you guys, which I see it as it's an issue I care very deeply about. I see it as kind of an inevitability. It's my marginal contribution to try and change people's minds on a certain policy might be better spent elsewhere, because I think we're on a train that's going to a destination, which is interesting by itself, because what I want to talk about today is how marriage is a social institution. So it has changed, and specifically because it's a social institution, we don't need the state involved in marriage at all, which is the, of course, crazy libertarian view. But a lot of the stuff that was being discussed up here, what libertarians would say about this, and I'm a very good representation of one of those, so I will say it, is that it's constructivist. Constructivist is a word, goes back to Friedrich Hayek, if anyone's ever heard of Friedrich Hayek, that discusses the ways in which the purveyors of society, the people who control the law, are trying to sort of manipulate it to their ends and to build it in some sort of rational way. And he constantly said, but you can't do this because there are groups and there are social relations, and people are far more than gardening, things that you can garden and plant, and they won't stay there. And I think Sherif's argument is super interesting. It's in a tradition of a lot of philosophy for essentialism and what is marriage. I think he's asking the right question. I call his view the Lego theory of marriage. It fits together perfectly. There's something, and I don't even mean that to be insulting, because there's a tradition in philosophy about a thing, a characteristic of something, a teleological kind of element, and how they go together to analyze it. But people aren't Legos in this way, and marriage is fundamentally a social institution. So the state, of course, wasn't always involved in marriage. This is something libertarians love to tell you about anything, especially if they're David Friedman, if anyone knows who that is. All the things that the state used to not do: money, criminal law, police, all these things that we think are essential. But then the state got involved with marriage for a variety of reasons. In America, it was highly tied to the Mormons. And one of the first things, if anyone's read the Reynolds case, and I've yet to find the really good law review article that explains how the DOMA decision applies to Reynolds. Reynolds is a case going back to the little almost war we had with Utah and getting them to, as a federal territory, to say that they weren't allowed to have polygamy. It was definitely based on animus and all those things. That's when we started really defining marriage. Also, Civil War pensions created a lot of that issues. We're trying to figure out how those would vest and who those would vest in. But it is not a necessary component of society, at least in the most basic sense. Society's not going to crumble. People will still get together. People will still form unions. They'll still figure out ways of doing this. It's not necessary. The other question to ask is, what happens when we do get the state involved in this? Well, I was recently in Germany, and two of my German friends got married. They're Bavarian. And of course, so they have a state religion type of thing. And they were talking about the bureaucratic rigmarole that they had to go through. And you can find this online. So I looked up how to get married in Germany. So, let me find, I had this. Okay, here we go. Yes. So there's a they call it a Standesamt, which is the official of vital statistics. You have to file a notice of impending marriage, for your marriage a few weeks before that time. It's about 65 euros to get married. You have to get a certificate for eligibility to marry. It has this provision in the code called best man. That was one of my favorite ones. So you can have a best man if you want, and you have to file an affidavit that you're single. I mean, of course, that is what true love is, right? That's what we think about. You know, that's what I'm sure all of you for your wedding day are thinking about, filing things with the state and going through bureaucratic loopholes and all these things to try and figure out how we're going to construct society in the best way. And that's kind of the thing, not necessarily that I oppose. It's not that I don't believe there's such thing as common good. It's I believe that the state's very, very bad at figuring out how to do it. So my answer to the question of what is marriage is I don't know. It's changing all the time. It can be a lot of different things. But when people who get to control the state for a fleeting moment in time want to come in and say, I have this idea of the common good and I think it's this, they end up screwing a lot of things up. You talked about divorce, which I think is fascinating. So I have a sort of an economics predilection. I think of divorce as the price of exit for entering a marriage contract. And so we had a near impossibility of getting out of a marriage at one point, so a very high price. And then we had no-fault divorce, so a very low price. But either way, we basically spend a lot of time talking about price fixing. It's exactly what we're doing. We're figuring out how to price fix the cost of divorce to produce the best social outcomes. And I don't know the answer to that question, and I challenge that any of you know the answer to that question either. I don't know how easy it should be to get out of a marriage. What I do know is that people form bonds without the state, wherein they proclaim and give up something costly to proclaim the permanence of that bond. This is a social institution that happens in a variety of instances. Kosher laws. You got to give up pork to be a Jew. That's giving up a lot. I love pork. Yeah, that's what to control the community, to say that you're making a permanent type of commitment to this so you don't become a parasite on the community. They ask you to give something up. This is the economic analysis of social institutions. Buying a ring for the woman. It's an indicator of how much you're willing to give up. This happens without the state. Could it be 2 people? Maybe. It was 3 people? Maybe. Could it be 4? Maybe. I think those are probably unstable, but I think that the social system would figure that out. Whether or not it's unstable, how it's going to evolve going forward. One of the things that the state generally likes to do is quantify you. And Germany they were the big innovators in quantifying people. And so with everything about the German marriage law, it really does go back to 1871 and the inauguration of every sort of administrative state of the Kaiser Wilhelm type of era. But James C. Scott, he's a political science professor at Yale, who's actually a Marxist, wrote an entire book about the state trying to quantify you and give you an identification of what you are. It's called Seeing Like a State. I highly advise it. His main point is that the state can't really deal with the way people actually live their lives because it's far too fluid, because we're not Legos. If any of you are from a small town, let's say Smithburg and Jonesville, the next town over, and there's a road that goes between Smithburg and Jonesville. What is that road called in Smithburg? Anyone? The Jonesville Road. What's it called in Jonesville? Smithburg Road. What does the state call it? County Road 137. They can't deal with that type of in numerology in human existence. But for the exact same reasons, we talk about trying to figure out marriage. We have these sort of line drawing debates. I can't draw a line between my best friend. I used to use it all the time as a ploy. 9 years old, I'll be your best friend if you give me your pudding cup type of thing. And the state's not going to solve that problem by actually quantifying what a best friend actually is. And we got BFFs, and we got besties, and we got FWBs, and we got DTFs, and we got getting pinned, and we got Facebook official, and we got all these things. These are all social things that have happened over the course of just the last 20 years that are beyond the ability of the state to actually figure out what the nature of a relationship is. I can make the exact same argument about it. Let me tell you about the essential characteristics of a FWB relationship. But I don't think the state should be involved in drawing those lines. It ends up getting a lot of things wrong. And it can end up getting a lot of things wrong for the thing that Sherif cares about. For going back to the divorce price-fixing question, well, usually the case of divorce, is basically impossible. I'm currently reading a biography of a World War I general, and the beginning part of it is pretty much an entire discussion about how much he and his wife hated each other, and how much they couldn't get out of their marriages, and how much they had mistresses and 4 kids who were locked in this marriage because the state thought that they shouldn't be allowed to get out of it. I'm not sure if that's a socially beneficial relationship, or with the no-cost side. The point is that when the state comes in and starts having a political fight over how and when are the best way to raise children, what are the prices that we should put on marriage, what are the prices we should put on getting out of marriage, it's going to do it wrong, and it's going to do it in favor of a specific group that usually happens to have power at the time. Those kind of constructivist methods is about reforming the world for the purposes of a certain vision of the world. So the answer to the question of, it might be the case at a time, Sherif's view of what marriage was the case. But as social creatures, as people who live in a social life, who change the way we have relationships all the time. Anyone here pinned? No. My mom used to have, did you put your pin on her yet? See, we change these all the time. As social creatures, marriage has now changed. And it has changed to what Sherif calls the revisionist view. That's the answer. Now it is a case that we think the reason, your argument is very interesting and very good, but it's very complex and very deep. But most people are not thinking about marriage that way because it socially has changed to something different. It has changed to a culmination for the ultimate expression of your love for someone else. That's what it is. And when the state is denying that to other people, it feels like they're denying that there's an ability of other people to have those emotions. They're not thinking like Sherif is thinking. I think we used to, but we're not anymore, so marriage has to change too. Now, I said the state should get out of marriage. Now, I also acknowledge that's not going to happen anytime soon. Just with the crazy tax code, we would take a long time to figure out what that's going to be. But, so having the state being involved in marriage and looking at the way the social institution has evolved itself, the constitutional analysis is fairly easy. Is there a rational reason to discriminate between gay marriage and straight marriage? And I don't think so. I think so, especially at the fact that so many of the things that John talked about that are allowed, for example, infertile couples, he addresses these points, so he doesn't not have an answer to these, but it's one of these things where their justification doesn't fit very well with the laws. And because of that, that's how you do a basic rational basis analysis for anyone who's already taken con law, and you see if it fits and it doesn't fit. It doesn't have to be animus, it doesn't have to be anything. And so my final point I want to make is about this and the family. Because going back to kids again, it really is beneficial, obviously, to the family unit as a family, maybe not as a marriage, to have homosexual couples getting into marriages. Because they can raise kids and they can have nice family lives. I am the first person to say the state has a parasitic effect on the family, which is why exactly we should allow gay marriage, the very least if we're going to have the state involved in it. Homosexual couples are high achieving because they often adopt. They have extremely high parenting success rates, as adoptive parents often do because of how much they have to go through. I think all of these concerns outweigh the concerns of society changing away from Sherif's view, which I think is respectable, defensible, but marriage is a social institution. It's changed. And we can just ride that train on to where it's going. So, thank you.
Before we go to the floor for questions, let me give each panelist a couple of minutes to respond to a couple of points they've just heard. So, back to Mr. Girgis.
Great, thanks. So I'll just start with Trevor's and then say something about John's. So part of what Trevor is saying is, look, the state is really bad at doing its job. And I agree with that. He's also said, look, there's no essence of marriage. It's an evolving social institution. You're basically asking the state to fix the price of exit and of entry. And the state's bad at drawing those lines, therefore it ought to get out of it. You could run exactly the same argument in exactly the same terms against property rights. And if there's anything that a libertarian believes in, it's property rights.
They're also a social institution.
Yeah, they are. No, exactly. No, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying, grant your idea that marriage is inherently just a social institution. The problem can't be that there's no clear lines to draw, because the same thing is true of property rights. Now, what is the reason that we have property rights anyway, whether you're libertarian or, well, anything short of a full-blown kind of socialist? The reason is that, one way of understanding it is that the costs of not having it are way too high. If you just think in terms of kind of liberty values, the cost to all of those values, the cost to the kind of individual flourishing, or however you want to conceive of it, of not having any property regime is much worse. And there's something very similar in the claim I'm making for why the state should be involved. Let's abstract from the gay-straight question by saying, let's suppose that you think that marriage encourages stability wherever it's imposed, whether or not the underlying conception of it is revisionist or conjugal. So filter out the debate between John and me. Let's just say you think it's just going to encourage stability wherever it's imposed. Then it seems to me you've got a very good reason to have the state involved in marriage, which is basically that there are huge, unconsented to third-party costs for not drawing that line somewhere. On the children who are not autonomous adults who chose to be in a relationship that didn't last very long and have suffered the consequences of that, and on the rest of society, which foots the bill when those children don't grow up as well. That they have an uphill battle. Sometimes they do great. Sometimes they're heroic single parents. We're not making absolute claims about this stuff, but we are making generalizations because the social science bears at least that much out. Stability is bad in all of these ways that impose huge third-party costs. So even if you think this is just a social construct, I think, as in the case of property, you think the costs justify a much lower cost way up front of much less coercively than property law, in fact, socially regulating this institution. But then the question is, well, what are you going to do when you do regulate it? Which vision of marriage is right? In particular, doesn't the Bob and Jane example show that my view is wrong? It's the reason that we don't give a fuller articulation of our view on this is that my co-authors and I are divided on it. But let's assume the worst for our view. Let's say that when you really persistify the view, it's impossible to explain how Bob and Jane can be married. I want to say a couple of things about that. One is that before you draw a conclusion about the merits of the conjugal view, you have to know what the alternative is. It's a truism in philosophy that you start out with common sense intuitions and you never quite end there, because any effort to draw a coherent line of best fit is going to leave some intuitions out. The reason you can't make a conclusive judgment about the conjugal view based on the Bob and Jane example is that you have no idea what the alternative vision is yet and what cases it would leave out or include in against our intuitions. Because John, in his argument, says relationships are good for people, marriage is good for relationships, and he's just expecting you, relying on you, to substitute your own full substantive conception of relationships in that premise, which he hopes will mean any two adults, but just two, who are unrelated and sexually interested in each other and more or less committed to permanence and exclusivity and have deep ways of fostering things, but not, which, when you start to spell it out that way, can look like just as gerrymandered a category, which is the thrust of my argument. My argument was, so grant that my view will have this, counterintuitive implication for the Bob and Jane case. Your view can't even explain at a general level any of the distinguishing features between marriage and companionship. And the view that can't explain some individual cases, like according to our initial common sense intuitions, is going to do better than the view that ends up collapsing the category entirely. That's the basic form of the claim. One more thing about that. Even the force of the idea that Bob and Jane aren't married will be like how bad, how tragic a conclusion that is to you will depend to some extent on your own view of marriage. It'll bring feedback right in from your view of marriage. First of all, it is counterintuitive to have the implication of John's view that there is no rational basis for feeling a lack in not being able to consummate, right? So that is one, I mean, the fact that it's a borderline case means that both views will have some surprising conclusions about it. But even aside from that, one reason it'll seem like an insult, and not just maybe counterintuitive, to say that Bob and Jane aren't married, is if you have the view of marriage as, among other things, as John said, your number one relationship. In other words, if you already have the revisionist view of marriage as being distinguished mainly by degree and not type of cooperation and union and common life. If you have that view, then they're just settling for less. It sounds like a denigration. But if you see marriage as one basic type of love and communion among other basic types, then you don't have that conclusion. Now, if I just asked, this is my final point, if I just were asked to address John's initial argument, relationships are good for people, marriage is good for relationships, it makes all these practical accommodation, it's a kind of public recognition. I would say if we really ran with that, if we took it to its logical conclusions, and I'm not saying I've given a principled argument against running with its logical conclusions. On my view, the coherent stopping point would be companionship, committed companionship. Whether it's two people or three, whether they're unrelated or related. I'm not talking about incest, I'm just saying unrelated but in a platonic bond, or unrelated. If they're going to make life together, and making life together creates certain concrete needs that it's required in justice to meet, then we ought to meet them where people make life together. The fact that my mom's brother and sister in Cairo are living together, have lived together ever since they were kids, have never married, committed to sharing all the burdens and benefits of common life. The fact that they would want to visit each other in the hospital, even if the jurisdiction there only allows parents or children, isn't any weaker a point because they're not in a sexual relationship. So if we run with him, I would say there's something else at stake, a different kind of policy question, where our answers might actually converge.
Thank you. You know, as Trevor was speaking and I was trying to weave together our different points, I thought somebody should really take a picture of the panel and post it on Facebook so we can make our throuple Facebook official.
Good face.
I'll tweet it too. Yeah. I want to say something very quickly about Trevor's point and then spend the bulk of my few minutes on Sherif. One of the reasons I don't say a lot about the constitutional arguments is that I think that there's room, actually, for different ways for the state to handle marriage or not handle marriage, and still be just and still serve equality. Like Sherif, I do think that the state has an important role to play. And like Trevor, I think it's not going to get out of the marriage business anytime soon, so I don't worry too much about that. But it is worth noting that for much of human history, the state was not involved in the marriage business, or at least not involved in the marriage business in the way that we understand it to be. So there's definitely room for that discussion. My view is simply that if it is going to get involved in the marriage business, it needs to acknowledge the fact that some of its citizens are gay or lesbian and happen to fall in love and settle down with and make commitments to persons of the same sex. On Sherif's view, particularly on the Bob and Jane case, that while our intuitions may suggest that, well, Bob and Jane were actually married, it's really hard to evaluate the case because I don't provide an alternative vision, and you have to sort of compare how my case fits with our intuitions and how his case fits with our intuitions. And he thinks in particular that his case can better handle the intuition that marriage is sexual and two-person and exclusive and so on. Part of the reason that I don't spend a lot of time talking about the positive description of what marriage is because I do think that it's fairly complex because, and this is something on which we agree, marriage is a social institution. I think about, this is an imperfect analogy, as all analogies are, but take baseball. We can talk about whether it's a good idea to have the designated hitter rule or get rid of the designated hitter rule. Isn't like today, like opening day? I'm a gay man, I have no idea. But I'm using baseball analogies. We can have the designated hitter, we could take it away, but we'd still be talking about baseball. But let's suppose we reduced the number of players to 2 and got rid of the bases and switched out the baseball bat for a tennis racket and so on. At some point we'd be talking about something that wasn't baseball anymore. although it still might be a game perfectly worth playing. It still might be a valuable thing for people to do. Goes back to my point at the end of my comments about the marriage maneuver, but my point with respect to what Sherif is saying is like you ask, well, why do all these things go together in baseball? Well, there's a historic fact about this. Similarly, there's an historic fact about the fact that people tend to fall in love, pair off, commit to each other, form families, set up house together, get into arguments, have ups and downs, et cetera, and so forth. This is, part of our world, and what the marriage institution does, both as a legal institution and as a social institution, is to respond to those facts on the ground. If there were a real problem with brothers and sisters caring for each other who are not able to visit each other in the hospital, or if there were, a problem with, other sort of committed household forms, and that this were a widespread problem, it might well be appropriate for the state to develop institutions in such a way that addressed those needs. But in fact, that doesn't seem to be a widespread problem, or at least we have enough other ways in which to address those problems. Finally, Sherif makes quite a bit of the fact that the conjugal view of marriage, and particularly the notion of comprehensive union, can explain all of these things about marriage as being sexual and two-person exclusive and so on. My own view is that the only reason it can do this is because the notion of comprehensive union is so slippery and vague. And so you can get it to actually say a lot of what you want to say and not say what you don't want to say. And let me just give you one example of this, and we can probably talk about this more during the Q&A. So comprehensive union is supposed to be a union on all different levels of mind, of heart, of body. People unite mentally in various ways. Like, so for one thing they do, they might collaborate on a book project together, like What is Marriage by Girgis, George, and Anderson. I've met Sherif's fiance. He's about to get married. I presume that after he gets married, he'll still be able to write articles with Robbie George. But how can he do this if his union with Gabby is comprehensive? Well, it's because comprehensiveness and exclusivity are in fact different things. And you say, well, comprehensive is comprehensive at all times and over time and so on. At this point, to me, it just seems like comprehensive union, we're squeezing a lot of juice out of that one orange, rather than, again, looking at the facts on the ground, looking at people's real needs, looking at people's real relationships, and responding to those as they are. To me, it becomes, comprehensive union, it's nice for anniversary card poetry, but it doesn't really give us the kind of rigorous details, the Legos, as it were, that Sherif suggests that it does.
So I was having dinner last night with a bunch of economists, anarchist economists, and we were talking about this question, and we had this interesting idea of what would be the most libertarian position in this anarchist viewpoint on marriage, gay marriage. And it was like, get the state out of marriage, and then also limit it to if you're going to have them involved, you need to limit it to as many people as you can, because in their view, marriage was just rent seeking. So those who look to get their marriages recognized by the states are just rent seekers trying to get a certain privilege from the state, so you should limit rent seekers as much as possible. I thought that was an interesting point, but not exactly the point I'm making today. So the line that Sherif had about property rights. So two things. I completely agree that the state's role in defining property rights, for example, how high above your land do you own, or where exactly is the line between, for water rights and all those things, help facilitate social cohesion. But fundamentally, property is also a social institution. You can go to places all throughout the world where there's no government defining property rights, and people amazingly still have property. The big difference between marriage and property, though, is that while property rights form an operating system for a free society of individuals to live their lives according to their rights of conscience and innovate their own types of social relationships, it's a background event. Marriage is a far higher sort of on the primary social needs type of list. So you generally create more political problems as you go up. If you have the Venn diagram of the thing that we all agree on, right? The courts, roads, national defense, that's a pretty big Venn diagram. But if you move up into public education, healthcare, things that we start disagreeing on, then the fights become very different than property rights fights. In terms of, we just need someone to define a line about how high above your land you own. Just choose one. Like, it's arbitrary but essential. But the kind of lines that you start defining when you have marriage debates for the state being involved in marriage, start drawing these lines right through the middle of people's houses in that analogy. A really good example of that is the Mormons. The Mormons had created an institution of polygamy that the state came in and said you can't do this anymore, which is a lot different than redefining property rights. A lot more core to your idea of yourself as a human being, the relationships you form. I don't know if the Mormon polygamy would work or not, but there are self-correcting forces in social institutions to trying to see if you could actually be married to 3 women, and I doubt it would last that long. But if it's not in equilibrium, it will spin out of control. So we actually don't need the state to fix those problems by itself. But this is the second point here, which is that by keeping the state out of marriage, you allow for certain social innovations that could occur. Now, I think that Sherif is probably right, given the history and the prominence of monogamous unions throughout the world. Maybe this is a social institution that we found that's a very good idea. But we're not allowing anyone to innovate those social institutions to see what else might work better for how we live our lives together, which is a lot of the conversations you have about polyamory and polygamy and all those things like that, which I don't think should be prohibited at all. So all the slippery slopes that anyone would put on me, I will ride the sled all the way to the bottom. Just so everyone knows, okay? I think that social institutions correct for many of those cases. I think incest should be legal. I don't think people really want to do it that much. So I think it should be legal, and they already, I don't think it should be condoned or encouraged, but the law doesn't stop people from doing it very much. It's social institutions and social pressures and shame and all stuff that stops people from doing things like that, more than laws that are kind of inherently unenforceable, right? So yeah.
All right, we have some time for some questions. I do think that when I go home and tell my wife about what I learned about marriage, I don't think I'm going to tell her that she's engaged in rent sinking. I would keep that from your girlfriend or boyfriend or whoever for the moment. We do have a few minutes. Any hands for questions? Yes.
I have a question for Professor Corvino. President Obama recently had the Fatherhood Initiative because the fathers are neglecting their children, especially in the inner city. Do you think that that's a contradiction to his views on marriage equality? Because he's basically saying there's a uniqueness to fathers, and it's a social problem we have to overcome. Oh, unless you're 2 lesbians, then it doesn't make any difference, and you can use one of these guys as a sperm donor. Isn't there kind of like he's not letting his Fatherhood Initiative inform his marriage equality stuff, or vice versa?
I don't think so. Thank you for that question, by the way. I don't think so, because I'm a person who believes that same-sex couples should be permitted to and legally recognized in committing in marriage. And I'm also somebody who believes that, generally speaking, we should honor the distinctive contributions of mothers and fathers. And furthermore, that there is something significant to many people about the biological connections they have with their biological mothers and fathers. And I think we can acknowledge that and honor that while still also recognizing that families that don't have that are still real families, that adoptive parents are still real parents, that childless couples can still make commitment in marriage, even though I think that one of the things that concerns me, because I am somebody who takes seriously biological connections, is that the debate over sperm donation and other forms of family formation has been pinned on the same-sex marriage debate. And I actually wish we could talk about them separately, because we might find that we have more in common than some people think. It's because we've divided this into 2 sides, where either you're for marriage equality and therefore you don't care about any of these things, and you think that, people should just, none of this matters, mothers, fathers, biological connections, none of it matters, or you think that it does matter and therefore you can't be in favor of same-sex couples legally marrying. I mean, I think that's a false choice.
Question over here.
Let me follow up on that because I'm very pragmatic. With all due respect to Sherif and Trevor, it sounds like you are arguing for the religious definitions of marriage. And I would suggest that if you walk down the aisle in the Catholic Church and Trevor, you walk down the aisle with your partner in the Unitarian Church, you both be happy. You don't need to conclude them. I think John's question is the interesting one. Why is society, why is government involved? Right back to the rights and all the rest of it.
I'm John, that's Trevor.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay. I was getting very confused.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
Right. In any event, my point is that I think historically marriage was developed as an institution without effective birth control. So that basically government and politicians, being the kind of rough justice folks that they are, set up a whole set of bundles of rights and responsibilities that went really with being a parent. You were just about 9 months off, generally speaking, in terms of the individual they were dealing with. And there was a very small percentage of people who actually did not have a child within 9 months of consummation of marriage. And my question becomes, going back to the libertarian point, doesn't look is that if you look upon historically now all of the benefits and costs of marriage as being tied up with having a child, and if I think my statistics are right, about 90% of all married women have children, and many of those that don't are very disappointed. For those of you who are under the age of 30, this may sound amazing, but a large number of people get married desperately want children and find out they can't. After the fact, I think that the argument that someone learns that they can't have children before the fact is vanishingly small example. Rather, only as I understand it, 10% of gay men who are couples have children. And lesbians are higher, but neither adopt more frequently than heterosexual kids. So again, real rough justice, close enough for government work. If a heterosexual couple, you're going to have a child, here's the bundle of rights and responsibilities that go with that. And it works 90% of the time.
So,
And if you're not, take that bundle of rights and add them when you adopt the child, or have the in vitro fertilization, or whatever it is that shows you're the 10% of the gay men who are going to have try to raise a child.
well, yeah, so good question, good points. First one, I don't think, I recall reading a while back about studies about trying to figure out how many women were pregnant at the time of their marriage in the 18th century in different areas. And it was an incredibly high number, right? Because the baby was 7 months, born 7 months after the marriage. I don't think it was mainly law or anything that was pushing that. I think it was, shotguns or shotgun weddings or the shame of the social institution was far stronger than any law that could happen. Now, one of the things that is absolutely true is that when conservatives argued in the 60s that birth control was going to fundamentally change the social institutions of society, they were right about that. Now, I don't think that means that we've all changed our social institutions. Women's attitudes towards sex have changed a lot since birth control, and they saw it was going to happen, and therefore our social institutions should change around those, and they have. It's just our law that isn't really updated that. You don't have to have kids in many situations. It's very different now than it was for historical reasons that you pointed out. So.
Question right over here.
Trevor, state's not going to be involved. Is the state going to compel the cake maker and the cater to gay marriage that may be done in a church that's
No.
Are they going to force employers to provide insurance to both couples, to gay couples? Are they going to allow children to be adopted by gay couples? The state's going to get involved in that or not?
Well, interestingly, yes. So most of those are being no. I mean, and the states being adopted by gay couples, yes. But we filed in the photography case about that in terms of coercing people to participate in marriages they don't recognize. This is just part of living in a free society with a huge amount of options available to you. So generally speaking, no. But specific questions we could talk about later.
Can I follow up on that real quick?
Go ahead.
But I just also want to say real quick, again, that's not even specific to the gay case, though. I mean, I might be against divorce and remarriage, and I might not want to cater your third or fourth wedding. I might think that Mormonism is a cult and not want to cater a Mormon wedding. I might think the Kardashians should never be allowed to marry publicly again. So, I mean, again, this gets pinned on
that law. It's the only law I support.
I think the one law would be. So again, this all gets pinned on the gay marriage issue when it is in fact a distinctive issue.
Yeah.
Distinct issue.
It's very good point. Not going to step in and money with other cases, almost marriage. They're not going to bother with this.
Well, the difference is that the
Religious
state steps
discrimination,
in. The state steps in for the purpose of those who have political power. I mean, this is the thing where that's why it's oddly primitive what the state kind of does, because there's a lot of people and a lot of diversity out there. And when you're trying to play the political game of marriage and what's going to be defined as, you have to be prepared to possibly lose that when the Romneys have so many kids that the Mormons take over the United States. By politicizing marriage, you have to be prepared to lose the political fight. In my world, you don't have to lose in a way that same-sex couples are losing right now.
I have a question. I would actually just like to hear Sherif's opinions on consequences, positive and negative, of homosexual adoption. If that union is considered, part of the reason for defense of state interference with the union is that the state can uphold the stability of marriage and the traditional view that you articulated. There's a lot of studies that confirm children raised by homosexual couples are very well benefited for it. And I think that in an increasingly tolerant society, the stigmas will make it much more possible, even for further benefits for kids. So what's to say of all the positive consequences if that view were allowed?
Sure. So basically the question is, what's your view on gay adoption or adoption by gay couples? I think that the social science that's often cited is, as you must know, heavily disputed within this debate and by people on different sides of this debate. The folks who favor adoption and usually also marriage by same-sex couples will say, look, all of the studies, all the important ones have said no differences. And the folks on the other side will say, well, you know what, actually it's a little complicated because those are mostly based on snowball samples, and they're the kinds of studies from which it's not possible to generalize to the population, which is really not because there's some nefarious plot to make the results come out one way, but because it's been really hard to get the kinds of samples that make that work. And this is something that occasionally is acknowledged on both sides. Jonathan Rausch has a review of the literature where he says something to this effect. So I think I'm still on the side that says this is something we want to wait for better data on to have a firm footing for policy. But having said that, I think whatever the results of that will be, there's going to be, whatever view you have of these issues, there's going to be some kind of ideal that you want to approximate as much as possible with your adoption policy, right? Adoption is a critical institution, but it's the institution that makes case-by-case decisions where the ideal, for whatever reason, is not met. And so if it turns out that moms and dads do contribute something distinctive, then I think where a home with a mom and a dad is available and they're committed to each other, that's great. You're going to be preferring that. Where there isn't one available, you see what is available, and so one key distinction here is that it's not true on my view, or I think on any of the kind of mainstream traditional views of marriage or parenting, that the problem is somebody's sexual orientation, right? This isn't the idea that there's a class of people, gay and lesbian, who are worse at caring and committing to the needs of children and the rest of it. It's primarily about whether moms and dads make a difference, whether biological connection makes a difference.
Over there.
I have a question for all three panelists, and I won't go into the law or anything, but the modern way we talk about marriage, regardless of whether it's from a legal perspective, is as a question of marriage equality. And I wanted to get a sense from the three of you whether you think that's a misnomer, because I think even Mr. Corvino's point, to not necessarily rely on an equality argument, you made a distinction between marriage and marriage. And so I wonder what all three of you think of the issue being framed as an equality issue, whether you think it's helpful or harmful
Well, so I think it demonstrates something about the way we've gone about constitutional law, especially equal protection law, in the last really 50 years since Brown. Equality has become a huge part of the debate. I'm not against it, but it's interesting because it caused the debate to change in a lot of ways. It's one of the reasons why we spent an inordinate amount of time talking about a gay gene. Because we needed to get to that Caroline Products type of situation where we could say this is a type of person and not just a behavior, which I think is not really the best way of doing constitutional law. But that's where we are, so rhetorically it works. But you take your point. It's not a great fit.
Look, part of the reason we started talking about marriage equality is because when we were talking about gay marriage or same-sex marriage or homosexual marriage, it was something of a rhetorical framing issue. It made people think, oh, they're looking for some special right, gay marriage, and it's like, we're looking for marriage. We want to have and to hold for better, for worse. I don't go get a gay driver's license. When I get my driver's license, I get a driver's license. When I get hungry, I get gay dinner or gay breakfast. Oh, brunch. But, catering, yes, and it's, I'm going to force Sherif to cater it. But one of the reasons I don't frame the debate that way is because I recognize that part of the debate we're having here is over what marriage is and what it. And look, if we're going to talk about marriage equality in a strict sense, so many different kinds of marriages I don't think of as equal, but I still think they should have equal legal rights. So, the young couple, the heterosexual couple getting married, about to start a family, is different from the elderly heterosexual couple who, are both widowed and are on their second marriage, and the state has a different stake in that. We as a society have a different stake in that. It's going to feel different to the participants. They're not equal, but we still give them equal legal rights, when it comes to the legal recognition of marriage.
I guess unsurprisingly, I think it's question-begging label. And the easiest way to see that is to try to think of a person who's seeking recognition of a relationship in which they say they find more fulfillment than the ones that are recognized now, who couldn't say, you're depriving me of marriage equality. Right? The fact that it's basically available as a term with the same rhetorical force and power in any of those cases shows that something's gone wrong. It's the conclusion and not the premise. Now, as a political slogan, almost every slogan is like that. Pro-choice assumes that the choice is legitimate because otherwise it wouldn't be interesting to be pro. Pro-life assumes that it's a life with basic rights. Otherwise, why be pro? You're not pro, oak trees lives. And so I think this is just a feature of political slogans. So I don't blame people for using it. It just gives me a way to open up my talks.
We have time for one more question. Over here.
This is for Professor Corvino. Depending on your answer to this question, I have a follow-up question. So should marriage be limited to couples?
I am somewhat agnostic on this question. I think that I seem to keep making this move tonight, but I actually believe this, that the question of gender and the question of number are separate questions. Historically, polygamy is a quite common form of marriage. In fact, there have been more societies that have embraced polygamy than not, which is not to say that there have been more polygamous marriages than not. Polygamy was typically the choice of the rich and powerful, the opportunity of the rich and powerful. And, one reason to be skeptical of extending legal marriage to multiple partner relationships is that when we look at the history of polygamy, it's typically polygyny, one man, multiple wives, where that tends to foster, in my view, not only a kind of sexism, but also certain economic problems where you have high-status males acquiring many wives and then lower-status males have become essentially unmarriageable. If part of the reason for marriage...
That's the rent-seeking part, right?
The rent-seeking,
if you're a super attractive guy, you want polygamy, right?
If part of the reason for marriage is to promote this kind of social stability where people have someone whose job it is to take care of them and vice versa, that seems problematic. And Jonathan Rauch has made this argument much better than I can. At the same time, I recognize that people form relationships in different ways, and just as, I said to Sherif, if there were a real problem with elderly brothers caring for each other who are not able to visit each other in the hospital, similarly, if you found, there are plenty of polygamous families in this country and in places like Texas and Utah and so on. If this were a real problem, I mean, one thing I do believe, I think it's very odd that we criminalize it. I don't simply mean that we fail to recognize it legally, but that actually it's against the law for me to regard multiple people as my wives, even if I don't try to legally marry them. That is, even if I'm not guilty of legal bigamy. I mean, that just seems strange. I can have multiple girlfriends, I can have multiple boyfriends, I can have multiple roommates, but once I start calling them my spouse, I'm breaking the law. I mean, I'll let the lawyers sort that out, but it strikes me as odd.
Agnostic.
Agnostic. Yeah, so I guess the question I would have to ask is, as a matter of social policy, what would be the effects of extending legal recognition to multiple partners, whether we're talking about the same sex or other sex? And that's a separate question from whether we should allow same-sex couples to marry.
So you wouldn't, I mean, you do support polyamories.
I am agnostic as to whether the state ought to. I'm a skeptic on this.
I think we all can join in thanking our guests for that wonderful performance. We're going to take a bow there. Thank you so much. I also want to thank ISI one more time. The raffle, if you signed up for that, Blair will email you if you won, and they'll get the books to you, and they'll just start sending you books forever. It's wonderful. They just come in the mail. It's amazing. It still happens. It's wonderful. I also want to thank the Collegium Institute that co-sponsored, Alliance Defending Freedom, and Jordan Lawrence also helped us put this event together. And the law school was also extremely supportive of us. So everything that Professor Beavis said at the beginning is correct. Penn Law is an amazing place. And Professor Beavis also for joining our panel at the last minute. I asked him to do this last night. This is our first forum of this sort, but it's also sort of my last hurrah. So I want to congratulate the new board. Rob Day has officiated several of the events tonight. Sophia Dye, Alex Caspary, Steve Iacovo, and John Moriarty. You have been running around making sure all of this goes well while I sit here and nod approvingly. It's one of my skills. Okay, finally, the moment you've been waiting for. There's a reception just outside these doors. We have quite a bit of libations, so please help us consume them. And food, and more food. Also, if you have a CLE evaluation form, make sure you give that to the CLE table so you can get the paper you need for your credits. Thank you.